Once upon a time, in a lush forest filled with towering trees and winding paths, there lived a clever fox. The fox was known throughout the forest for his cunning nature and sharp mind. One hot summer afternoon, as the sun blazed in the sky, the fox was strolling through the woods in search of something to eat. His stomach growled with hunger, and he hoped to find a tasty morsel to satisfy his appetite. As he wandered along a familiar path, the fox's keen eyes spotted something that made his mouth water. Hanging from a high vine just over the edge of a tall fence was a bunch of the juiciest, ripest grapes he had ever seen. Their deep purple hue glistened in the sunlight, and the fox could almost taste their sweet juice. "Those grapes look absolutely delicious," the fox said to himself, licking his lips. "I must have them. They will quench my thirst and fill my hungry belly." The fox stood on his hind legs, stretched his neck as far as he could, and snapped his jaws toward the grapes, but they were just out of reach. Determined not to be defeated, the fox took a few steps back to give himself a running start. With a swift sprint and a powerful leap, he soared into the air, snapping his teeth where he thought the grapes would be. But he missed. The fox landed back on the ground, more determined than ever. "I just need to jump higher," he thought. He took an even longer running start this time and jumped with all his might, reaching for the tantalizing grapes. Once again, he missed. The grapes dangled tauntingly above him, seemingly just out of reach. Sweat began to form on the fox's brow as he continued his attempts. He tried standing on his tiptoes, climbing the fence, and even using a fallen branch as a makeshift ladder. But no matter what he did, the grapes remained elusive. Each attempt left the fox more frustrated and exhausted. After what felt like hours of trying, the fox finally sat down beneath the vine, panting heavily. He stared up at the grapes, feeling a mix of disappointment and anger. "Why won't these grapes just fall into my mouth?" he grumbled. As the fox sat there, catching his breath, he began to feel embarrassed by his failure. He looked around, hoping none of the other forest animals had seen his futile efforts. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat, so he decided to save face in the only way he knew how. "Those grapes are probably sour anyway," the fox declared loudly, hoping to convince himself as much as any potential onlookers. "Who would want to eat sour grapes? They're not worth my time or effort." With a final disdainful look at the grapes, the fox turned and trotted away, his head held high. As he walked, he kept telling himself that the grapes were probably not as delicious as they seemed. He convinced himself that he was better off without them, and that he had made the right decision to leave them behind. However, deep down, the fox knew the truth. The grapes were likely sweet and delicious, and his failure to reach them was due to his own limitations. But rather than accept this reality, he chose to soothe his wounded pride with the idea that the grapes were not worth having. The end moral of the story: it's easy to despise what you cannot have. The fox's rationalization about the grapes being sour reflects how people often cope with their own failures or shortcomings. Instead of admitting their own limitations or the difficulty of a task, they might convince themselves that what they wanted wasn't worthwhile after all. This story teaches us to recognize this behavior in ourselves and strive to face our challenges with honesty and perseverance.